fact, transcendentalism is best thought of as a stew of conversations rather than a cohesive and goal-oriented movement of any kind. However, all these conversations generally coalesced around two poles, and these poles found themselves in argument with each other. And this argument writ itself into the mutating DNA of Unitarianism and is very much with us today. I should say it haunts us to this day, for it is a problem. Don't you love when ministers tell you that you had a problem that you didn't know you had? And now you need to fix it. But I am getting ahead of myself. I will identify the problem in a moment. Right now, it's enough to know that transcendentalism came into the world as an alternative worldview in an era in which religious truth was riveted to the traditional and rather literal interpretation of the Bible, while scientific truth was emerging and grounded in the materially measurable and determinism. But now here comes a way of being that attributes truth to the inner light of each individual. It was truly radical stuff. And the warnings against it, of which there were many at the time, were not without merit or even realized consequence. As it was, more than one Unitarian transcendentalist minister found it difficult to remain in the pulpit. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, who we'll hear more about in a moment, had many Unitarian pulpits barred to him. And Emerson himself found it better to leave the denomination entirely. It was clearly a different time. Yet transcendentalism rooted in and eventually flourished in Unitarian circles because Unitarians were reading Scripture in the light of new studies in its historical contexts and in such a way that Scripture itself seemed to lead them, ironically and by my account truthfully, out of the Scriptures and into direct personal experience of revelation. At the end of the day, Christ became more of a prophet than a God, and God became less of a persona and more like the Force, I guess you could say that. Particularly for transcendentalists, God was an inner light that permeates and emerges from all of nature, so that the material world is the spirit world. We people are, of course, of nature. So each of us, each of you, are then inherently divine. This world we live in, wrote Emerson, is but thickened light. The fact that this line of thinking preconceives what our physicists are discovering today is stunning. After all, these thoughts were being thought some time ago. The transcendental conversation hit its peak just prior to the Civil War, conflict whose cause, the question of slavery, came to have its own effects on transcendentalism. And in fact, some of the movement's bright lights, with Theodore Parker at their helm, actively agitated against American aristocracy, for women's suffrage, and, of course, against slavery, even so far as to help finance John Brown and his doomed slave uprising at Harper's Ferry. And this activism reveals the other part of the binary that I alluded to earlier. You see, there's the Emersonian position where the world is transformed by the recognition of the inherent divinity of each person and the cultivation of that divinity, the cultivation of each person's self. And then there is the position that, for simplicity's sake, we'll say was represented by Theodore Parker, who found that transcendentalism's recognition of the inherent divinity of each person compelled one to work for the political realization, the social realization of the dignity inherent in each of us. One was an experience of the self in conversation with the universe. The other was an expression of justice in society. So now you have on the one hand a strain of thought that evolved from self-reliance, evolved into a kind of hyper-individualism. And on the other hand, you have what grew into a total commitment to social activism, with no theological supports. Both of these stances are valuable and even formative of the American experience, but each of them has their pitfalls when taken not as a spiritual path, but as justifications for self-indulgence rather than self-work. And yes, social action may be self-indulgence in disguise. And obviously, self-reliance can all too easily turn into narcissism and smug isolationism. And these charges were, in their own time, leveled the one at the other. History has done little to correct this argument. On the contrary, the passage of time and popular misappropriation of each attitude has only further corrupted these strains, and whiffs of such corruption are often detectable in our congregations today, and this is a problem.